When we think of the 19th century pioneers who built the British railway network, we might think of such men as George Stephenson, Richard Trevithick, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and then, lurking at the back, there's this man here. George Hudson remains a controversial figure even 150 years after his death. Whether he's a hero or a villain is hotly debated among historians, with some viewing him as a pioneer and some viewing him as a sort of evil fat controller. Who was he? Hudson was born in 1800 in Howsham, a village near York. He was the son of a farmer. Leaving home at the age of 15, possibly after getting a girl pregnant, he moved to York and became an apprentice in the draper's shop of Bell and Nicholson, here. He demonstrated a sharp eye for business. He married Elizabeth, the daughter of Nicholson, and would eventually be made a partner in the firm. By 1827, the company would be one of the most successful in the city. That same year, Hudson inherited £30,000 from his great-uncle, or around £3.1 million in today's money. This enabled George to broaden his horizons. In the early 1830s, he got into politics, joining the York Board of Health and the York Conservative Party. In 1833, he would help to establish the York Union Banking Company. He was a popular and charismatic figure, and in 1836, 1837 and 1845 he would be elected Lord Mayor of York. In 1845 he would be elected MP for Sunderland. But I'm going to work on the basis that you're here for the railway stuff, so let's get to it. As I've said before, Hudson was a sharp businessman. In 1830, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened, linking the industrial powerhouse of Manchester with the major port of Liverpool and generating plenty of income for its shareholders. Naturally, other businessmen wanted in, and Hudson was no exception. In 1833, he became a shareholder in the Leeds to Selby Railway. In 1834, he met George Stephenson, the railway pioneer at Whitby. Stephenson was, like Hudson, a self-made man from a humble background, and the two quickly became friends. Stephenson was the engineer behind the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, but he believed the railways could do more. He envisioned a whole network of railways crisscrossing the country, linking the towns and cities and bringing prosperity to the nation. Hudson was listening. He liked Stephenson's idea for a line from London to Newcastle, but couldn't help noticing something he considered to be a fatal flaw. It didn't go to York. There's a quote attributed to Hudson, "Make all the railways come to York," sometimes rendered as "Make all railways come to York," but my attempts at a Yorkshire accent are frankly dismal. The quote may be apocryphal, but nevertheless, Hudson was very enthusiastic about the concept of putting the city on the railway map. Hudson met with a number of other Yorkshire businessmen and formed the York and North Midland Railway. This would run from York to Normanton, where it would connect with the North Midland Railway, which formed part of a series of lines that led to London. It would also connect with the aforementioned Leeds and Selby Railway. Stephenson was to be the engineer, and Hudson, of course, was to be the chairman. The first section opened in 1839, and the line was completed in 1840. George Stephenson's son, Robert, would supply locomotives from his own works. The York and North Midland was an expansionist company. In 1844 they took over the Leeds and Selby Railway. They would build a line to Scarborough in 1845, and that same year take over the Whitby and Pickering Railway. By the end of the 1840s, they had a veritable network of railways across Yorkshire. In 1854, after Hudson had left the company, they would merge with two of their competitors to form the North Eastern Railway, one of the most prosperous railways in Britain. But that wasn't all Hudson was working on. The key to the York and North Midland Railway's success was the north to south route, which was threatened very early on in 1842. Three of the companies that made that route up, the North Midland Railway, the Midland Counties Railway and the Derby and Birmingham Junction Railway, were in serious financial difficulty, caused in large part by competition. Hudson proposed a merger. In 1843, the three companies formed the Midland Railway, with Hudson as chairman, of course. And there was more. In 1841, Hudson became chairman of the Newcastle and Darlington Junction Railway, a failed project. In 1843, he proposed a Newcastle and Berwick Railway. In 1847, they were amalgamated into the York, Newcastle and Berwick Railway. Hudson was looking north. He had his eye on the North British Railway, a similarly expansionist railway company in Scotland. Unfortunately for him, his proposal to take them over was turned down. Meanwhile, he wanted his own route to London, and in 1845 he became chairman of the Eastern Counties Railway. He expanded this impoverished company across East Anglia, and it would eventually become the Great Eastern Railway, another major player on the railway scene, albeit something of a poor cousin to his other companies. By this point, Hudson controlled a quarter of Britain's railways. He had acquired the well-deserved, if satirical, nickname of the Railway King, becoming perhaps the most influential man in the British railway industry. In 1842 he set up the Railway Clearing House, which was an administrative organisation that allowed financial cooperation between railway companies. With so many different companies operating trains over so many different railways, it was hard to work out how receipts should be divvied up. The Clearing House was founded to relieve that headache. It's no exaggeration to say that his business acumen was responsible for creating much of the British railway network. He took ailing companies and turned them into major railways, bringing prosperity to towns and cities across the nation, as Stephenson had envisaged. His acquisitions and mergers turned local railways into main lines. Had it not been for his intervention, York might have been left behind by the railway revolution. So why is he so controversial? Well, Hudson wasn't exactly in the railway business for philanthropic reasons. His aim was to make money, and fair enough, no businessman intends to die in poverty. That's capitalism, comrade. But Hudson was, how can I put this, kind of shady. He aimed to enrich himself by fair means or foul. For example, he opposed the construction of the Great Northern Railway, which aimed to provide a direct route from London to York, because it would take business from his lines. And then there's the financial stuff. Now, I'm no economist, as my bank manager will tell you, so I'm going to simplify a bit. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway had been a huge financial success, and many investors assumed that the railways were easy money. Actually, many of them weren't. Not that you'd know if you were an early investor in Hudson's railways, which paid out a very decent dividend. You might be asking yourself, if so many of his companies had been failures when he took them over, where was the money coming from? The answer was cheating. He would cut costs on his railways, then pay the shareholders out of capital. He would borrow huge sums of money. He would trade shares between his companies, often at an artificially inflated price. And of course, he wasn't opposed to the odd bit of bribery. But on the surface, all was well. For many investors, as long as they had their dividends, they weren't going to rock the boat. As Sir Thomas Legard put it, when railways and railway shares were black as night, Hudson ruled and all was right. This was the era of railway mania, a period when people raced to invest in new railway schemes, however implausible. But it couldn't last. Hudson's empire was a juggling act, and towards the end of the 1840s he couldn't keep up. The railway mania was coming to an end. The time came to repay loans, which the companies couldn't. Shareholders started asking awkward questions. The finger of blame pointed squarely at Hudson. He was forced out of his companies. The Railway King was dethroned. He found himself in debt to the tune of £750,000. He would spend much of his remaining years either in debtor's prison or trying to evade debtor's prison, often fleeing to the continent. He lamented his great-uncle's legacy, complaining that had it not been for that, he would never have got into the railway business. To which his creditors no doubt replied, "Oh, my heart bleeds." But though Hudson was a swindler who had ruined countless lives with his financial jiggery-pokery, he wasn't without his friends. In York he was viewed as a great benefactor and philanthropist, with friends and well-wishers raising money to pay his debts, the last of which were dropped in 1871. That same year, Hudson would pass away in London. In accordance with his wishes, he was buried at Scrayingham in Yorkshire. I have no doubt that you can see why his reputation is a complicated one. He was a crook, for sure. His motivations were selfish, and he didn't care who he conned along the way. But at the end of it all, Britain was left with perhaps the finest railway network in the world, at least until Beeching came along. But that's another story. Maybe a crook was what the railways really needed. Hi all, I hope you enjoyed that. I find the early history of the railways really interesting, and I'm thinking the railway mania might merit a video in its own right. Let me know if that's something that would interest you in the comments below, and consider leaving a like, sharing, and mayhap hitting the subscribe button. If you want to know a bit more about Hudson, I'll link a video by Chris Eden Green in the description below. He deals with some of the stuff I skipped over, like the strange story of how he came to be arrested. And I will see you again very soon. Cheerio.